Hello everyone, welcome to the next lecture in our series Competition Policy and Strategy. Today we're going to talk about vertical restraints, so chapter H3. In chapter H2 we have been talking about horizontal restraints, and now we're talking about horizontal cooperation, and now we're talking about vertical restraints. So we're basically talking about things that are along the value chain and which are considered as restraints to competition. So what are we talking about? We're talking about violations of 101.1, and according to these we have vertical restraints or examples of it that we have listed here. So selective distribution, exclusive dealing, resale price maintenance, and quantity forcing. These fall under the umbrella of 101.1. In economic theory, some of them aren't really, so it's not clear how the effect of these restraints is not always clear per se from an economic standpoint. And we will learn that today when we look at basically a huge part of these. All of these we're going to examine, we are going to examine exclusive dealing, resale price maintenance, and quantity forcing, and selective distribution we will look at the end. But we will see that basically the latter 3 points here, the effect is kind of ambiguous when we look at theory models. However, there are anti-competitive effects that are associated to this, and we have to distinguish between two types of possible anti-competitive effects. One of them is the intra-brand competition, and the other is the intra-brand competition aspect. Inter-brand competition means that we have competition between two manufacturers, for instance Pepsi and Coke, right? And we might reduce competition on this manufacturer level, so the upstream level, by these vertical restraints. So it could be that we have even collusion on the manufacturer level. Then we might reduce competition within a certain brand. So basically, if we think of the Pepsi-Coke example, really it is just an example, then it would be a vertical restraint could reduce the competition of the retailers that sell Pepsi or Coke. Right? So within a brand, intra-brand competition. It could also be associated to aspects of foreclosure or entry barriers. So one could think of many ways how these types of vertical restraints actually harm competition. However, as with many vertical restraints, or basically vertical types of cooperation, there are also pro-competitive effects that could play a role. And one of the most important things here is that we have vertical externalities, so something like a reduction of free riding along the value chain. We will talk about that later. Then, of course, we might eliminate double marginalization, which is also an internalization of a vertical externality. We have already seen that where an upstream firm just included a monopoly markup on its marginal cost, and the downstream firm purchased the product for this marked up price, and then again included a monopolistic markup, and in the end the consumer basically suffered from two simultaneous monopolistic markups. You could use an oligopoly example, same principle, and you could eliminate that if you had these types of restraint or any vertical cooperation here. We could also realize economies of scale or scope if we could pool production or anything, so we would have some sort of efficiency effects here. So in the end, but that is just due to the nature of these things. When we look at the vertical component here, not all types of cooperation or collusion is actually negative in terms of economic the economic effect. So there could always be like benefits that we can think of, and it's in terms of theory, it's easier to get to these potential positive effects in a vertical component than it is in a horizontal component, right? So if you design or if you model collusion between competitors, it's pretty tough to get a situation where the consumers benefit, for instance. So something that is relatively rare. But that is not the case with vertical restraints. And today we're first talking about the free rider effect along the value chain, and we just base our arguments here on a Telser, on the article of Telser in 1960, which was published in the Journal of Law and Economics. And here we basically look at the classic effect of free riding along the value chain, where we first think of service provision that is offered by retailers. That could be advertisement, expert advice, physical inspection, that could play a role here. And the service provision is provided by retailer A, and retailer B, who does probably not offer the service provision, still benefits of that. And that's a positive externality that comes from A, or is generated by A, and B benefits, and probably also the manufacturers. The problem is the free riding here is that the service provision is costly, right? So if you want to have expert advice, you have to hire an expert. And if you want physical inspection, you have to have showrooms to do that. But you have non-excludability, right? So we will come to examples later. In any case, the service provision that A provides could benefit B, and we could end up in a situation of market failure where if the positive externality is not internalized, it is not offered, right? And this is especially relevant nowadays where we have pronounced effects of online versus offline competition, where service provision is usually offered offline, or at least the dimension of services offered online are different from those that are offered online. And usually we have the online retailers having cost advantages, right? So if you want to supply an entire country, you just need some logistics hubs, and you just have to maintain them. Whereas if you want to supply entire Germany entirely with a retail chain, basically with physical sales points, you have much higher average costs. So it's basically good for you from a cost perspective to be an online retailer, basically, sometimes. And the free riding aspect comes with the consumer that uses the services offered offline and buys the product online then, because it's probably cheaper. Vertical restraints can actually be used to condemn this problem, and that's what we'll see in the following. An example here, or two examples, are the Essex and the Coty case. Essex being like running shoes, and with this we can formulate the example here, which like illustrates the entire problem. Like if you think of if you want to buy a running shoe, it's mostly smart to get into a store and to potentially even get an analysis from an expert who tells you, okay, you have this type of foot placement and you need this and that shoe that is good for you. And then you get this entire advice, and then the professional tells you, look, you have to buy this shoe, that's the best running shoe for you. And now you're smart and say, okay, I can pay you $200 here, but if I look at Amazon, it only costs $120, so I buy it online. And that's the problem, right? Because if that is put to an extreme, then you probably don't offer this service anymore. And Essex just said, well, look, I won't offer my shoes online, basically, or only in my own stores. And that the purpose or the argument behind it would be that we want to condemn this free riding problem. There's also a quality component associated to it, but just look at the cases if you want to get an idea. Okay, so if we want to analyze that, we start with a model that is provided in Motta's standard textbook, right? And this model is very elegant because it contains a lot of our vertical restraint examples, right? So we have a simple model where we have upstream, where we have an upstream manufacturer that produces with marginal cost C and sells at a wholesale price W. Downstream we have two retailers, 1 and 2, who sell the good, and they can choose service provision. And the service provision is denoted E, could stand for effort, for instance. And the consumer's demand looks like this. So we have something like a given or constant willingness to pay for the product, maximum willingness to pay, and this is shifted upwards if there is service provision. And we assume that the service provision that is exerted by firm 1 is completely adaptable by firm 2, right? So if we think back to our RJV example, so research joint ventures, this is a spillover basically. So it doesn't affect the cost, but it affects the demand function. And what it actually does in mathematical terms is just like if this would be the original demand function, then if we have higher service provision, it would be shifted outwards, right? So that's basically what happens here. And based on that example, there we can see the externality immediately, because E1 benefits firm 2, even though firm 2 didn't invest basically. We have no further cost downstream. Sorry to write it that way. The cost function downstream is this one actually. Sorry. This is the cost function downstream. We have a cost for the quantity, which is basically we purchase at a wholesale price W, a given quantity Q, so that's basically our variable cost. And then we have the costs of doing or offering service provision, right? And on the downstream level, we assume that we have better competition. So we will analyze several scenarios within this model framework, and that's why I think it's very elegant to use the Motta model here. We start with vertical separation, so basically the setup where we didn't intervene in any case, and we didn't take any steps to take care of the free rider problem. Then we look at vertical integration, which basically means that all the firms merge. And that completely eliminates our externalities, because we know by vertical integration we basically pool the objective functions or internalize entirely the externalities here. So that would basically, from the firm's perspective, be the first pass. And what we will see is that also the consumers benefit. Then we have exclusive territories and franchise fees. That's basically our first vertical restraint here. Then we have RPM and franchise fees, and then we have RPM and quantity forcing, right? So we basically go through multiple of our, or 3 or 4 of our exemplary vertical restraints here. So first thing we do is look at our baseline scenario, which is vertical separation, so we don't do anything basically. Downstream we are in better competition, so the retail prices of both retailers will be equal to the wholesale price. What will be the service provision downstream? Well, each firm maximizes its profits, which is price minus wholesale price, so retail price minus wholesale price times quantity, and in the quantity we have our 2 service provisions minus the cost of offering the service provision here. And we already note that with better competition we have price equal, or retail price equal wholesale price. This is what you see here. That basically means that this term here will be equal to 0, and if this is 0, then we don't have any revenues, 0 profits. And if we differentiate the resulting function with respect to EI, so the service provision, we will see that the derivative is negative everywhere, right? So that means that as soon as you invest in services, you will decrease your profits. So for every positive investment level, your profits will decrease, so you won't invest in services, right? So service provision will be 0 in in equilibrium. And the problem is pretty clear. I already indicated that in the beginning. The service provision benefits both retailers, but no retailer can reap any benefits of the service provision, because betroth competition leads to zero profits, which means that there is no incentive to invest in services. The upstream firm anticipates that, and the demand function upstream will basically be the maximum willingness to pay minus the wholesale price, and there is no service provision, and we just can calculate the profit maximizing wholesale price with separation here, which is basically the monopoly price, and then we get our industry profits, which is just the upstream profits because there are no downstream profits. We can calculate the consumer surplus and the ensuing welfare, right? And that's our one of our baseline scenarios. Now, next, we look at vertical integration. Vertical integration means that we pool all the firms. So we just say that we have one firm that maximizes joint profits. So there is basically one entity that sells the product at a given price for the given quantities, for a given quantity or demand function. So that's the demand here, minus the cost for our service provision, right? And we just differentiate this function with respect to E1 and E2, and then we get our first order condition for the service provision, and we do the same with respect to PI. So we get our first order condition for the price, and that means that we have, we can assume symmetry here, so E1 equals E2, and that way we would only have two equations with two unknowns, and then we could solve, and we will end up with this service provision, this price, this quantity, and all these remaining terms here, right? So it's just an example of a calculation here. I hope that the intuition becomes clear. It is a nice practice to just do that, and we will basically treat that as a benchmark case, or as the other extreme case, right? What is important to note is that this is the first best service provision, and this is the first best quantity from the viewpoint of the firms, right? So we will use these two terms, or these two, it's a number basically, because it's only dependent on, of course, it's equilibrium number, so it's only dependent on exogenously given parameters, and we will use these because we implement these with different mechanisms later, right? So just keep in mind that we will skip back to this slide multiple times. Okay, so first thing we notice with respect to vertical integration is that it increases welfare, right? And the problem is that, the driver of that is that the service provision basically shifts outward demand, which is good both for consumers and producers. You see that also consumer surplus increases, right? At least in this given case where we have assumed that that one parameter, on the cost, is basically larger than 1/2, and we have this given by assumption. So. It's a technical assumption here. And so in our case, vertical integration increases welfare, it increases consumer surplus. And the reason is that basically the competition downstream without vertical integration chokes the entire investment incentives, and nothing is internalized. And if we want to foster innovation, we would have to soften competition downstream. How can we achieve that? Well, here we do it via vertical integration. And even though we soften competition, we overcompensate that by higher quality, you can say, by shifting out the demand function. And that's good for the consumers as well. So that means that service investments here are optimal, and it would be optimal to move, so efficient in a sense, to move from the separation to the vertical integration outcome. However, this might not always be possible to just vertically integrate. So we have talked about merger control in chapter G. There might be certain aspects that play a role and just mean that it's not possible to go with the vertical integration path. So possible, right? And the question is, how can we achieve a similar effect? So how can we make the outcome more efficient without the firms vertically integrating? In particular, what are the effects of the vertical restraints that we have been talking about? And that's what we're going to look at next. First thing we're going to look at is exclusive territories and franchise fees. Why do we include franchise fees? Well, it's the two-part tariff component to it, right? So it is reasonable to assume that since we have an oligopoly setting here, that the firms are not able to find any type of efficient tariff, and an efficient tariff is usually one that is not only dependent on a single parameter, right? So it's always good to have another, how would we say, it's an instrument, also technically speaking, but it's always better to have more instruments available, since you can always just not use the instrument, right? And here we just assume that the other instrument beyond the, or in addition to our linear price, is the fixed fee here. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, we basically say that the market is divided into two different territories, such that both retailers are assigned 50% of demand. And again, we have a fixed fee and a variable price here, and the first thing we do is to look at the profit maximization problem of the retailer in order to get to the equilibrium. The retailer has two instruments, the price and the retail price and the service investment. The margin is retail price minus a per unit price, which in our case we have normalized to C, because we have the fixed fee in order to take out the because we have in order to take out the problem here, so the incentive problem, and we want to basically we can determine our surplus using the fixed fee. So what we have here is the quantity over 2. So basically we have assigned that the territories are assigned in a way that each firm maximizes, or each retailer serves 50% of the consumers. This is basically what we have here. We have here the investment cost, and here we have the fixed fee. Again, as I said, this is the instrument that the upstream firm uses to take out rent. If we differentiate this one with respect to the service provision, then we get to this first order condition. If we differentiate with respect to the retail price, we get to the other optimality condition. So we basically have the similar problem for the other firm J, so we can assume symmetry here. So that means that we can assume E1 is equal to E2, P1 is equal to P2, and given that we again have only two equations and two unknowns which we can solve, and from that we can determine the equilibrium solution, which we will look at on the next slide. Okay, so if we calculate the equilibrium, we get to this service investment, and if you compare it to the solution before, let me just briefly do that. Here we have V minus C over 2 times gamma minus 1, and here we have, with exclusive territories, 2 times gamma minus 1 in the term in parentheses in the denominator, right? So this one here. And that reduces the service provision. So what we can immediately see is that the service provision is lower than in the vertical integration scenario. However, it's higher than with separation. So we see that exclusive territories kind of internalize the vertical externality here, in a sense that we improve compared to the situation where we have done nothing. But the situation is less efficient than with vertical integration, because basically 50% of the investment, of the service investment, is not internalized. So there's still uninternalized positive externalities here. Based on the solutions, we can compute the joint profits, the joint consumer surplus, and welfare. right? So you can compare these numbers. You will realize that it's an improvement compared to S, right? So it's more efficient than S, also from the viewpoint of the consumers, but it's less efficient than VI. So we basically improved, but not perfectly. And it's also important to note that even if we only let one retailer serve the entire quantity of consumers, then service provision would be suboptimally low because the marginal costs for service provision are assumed to be quadratic, which basically means that the cost for service provision are quadratic, which means that we have increasing marginal costs. So if we have two firms supplying half of the optimal service provision, the costs are lower than if only one firm served all, because we basically, like if you are here 2 times, then it's smaller than if you just take this here and you will end up here. Basically something like this, right? So that's the problem. Or one problem here, but that's just by assumption. Basically, we could change that, and the solution would look like slightly different. However, the important thing is that with exclusive territories, you internalize part of the positive externality here, but not perfectly. So now let's look at RPM, resale price maintenance. What does resale price maintenance actually mean? Well, it means that the upstream firm, so let us draw a little picture here. So the upstream firm serves the 2 downstream firms, but the upstream firm sets the retail price that firm 1 and firm 2 charge. Right? So the upstream firm basically says, okay, I give you this and this output, but the price will be X, for instance, right? And that means that we eliminate price competition on a downstream stage, but we have not eliminated service provision. So we just ask ourselves now, what happens to service provision? The first thing we gotta ask is, what retail price will the upstream firm choose? And that's pretty simple. It will be the vertical integration outcome. So because that's basically the monopoly price. So the upstream firm will fix retail prices at monopoly level. That's bad at first glance because you pay monopoly prices. However, the question now is whether it will be offset by an increase in service provision, so in quality. Sorry, I have to be careful here with the notation. So what happens on the downstream stage? Well, the profit maximization looks like this. A downstream firm will, with a given price, maximize this term here, right? So you have seen that before. Let me jump back briefly. That was too far. Yes, that's where I wanted to go. It's almost the same places here. What you see here is that the 2 terms look pretty similar. The difference is that here PI was basically fixed at the retail price level, which basically means that this term was 0. Now it looks different because VI exceeds W, right? So this term here is positive. That means that this term here does not drop out. So if you differentiate that, it will look differently. And that's the first order condition here. So from this first order condition, you can infer what each firm will invest in services given the optimal, the price chosen by the upstream firm. You will see that this is basically that you basically can choose. The instrument here that we still have to determine is the wholesale price, right? So the variable that is still inside here is the price that the upstream firm charges from the downstream firm, so the wholesale price per unit, right? So what this means is that the upstream firm can steer the downstream firm's service investments by setting the wholesale price. So what does the upstream firm do here? We can assume that it wants to receive or to achieve optimal service provision. Why? Because we still have franchise fees to draw out the resulting surplus, right? So our profit is not really determined by our wholesale price, but by our tariff. So we use the wholesale price here to induce the optimal service provision, right? So we choose W such that EI of W, so our optimal service investment, in equilibrium will be equal to our first best service investment which we had in vertical integration. So what the upstream firm does with RPM and franchise fees is to set on the retail level the price that would occur in vertical integration, so the monopoly price basically, and it will induce, based on this price, using the wholesale price, a service level that is also equal to the level in vertical integration, or the monopoly level. And it can do that by using this formula basically, and we want this one to be equal to the service provision in vertical integration. And now we briefly jump back because I told you that this is the optimal service investment, so we want our former function that we have seen to be equal to this one here, right? And that's what you see in this equation here. So this optimal service investment as a function of W should be equal to our first best service investments, and then that one we can rearrange with respect to W, and then we will end up with this expression here. So this would be the wholesale price under RPM that induces the optimal service investments. And the crucial point here, if you simplify that or check, you will see that this one is lower than C. What this means is that the upstream firm sells at a per unit price that is below the wholesale price to the downstream firms to induce the optimal service investment and to generate the optimal retail price, right? And this is only possible if there are franchise fees, because otherwise it would make losses, right? So, what can we learn so far about RPM in our example here? So we can replicate the first best solution. We can even choose a wholesale price to achieve that, but the wholesale price has to be below marginal costs. And the fixed fee that we're setting has to compensate for the ensuing losses upstream. However, it's not clear what the fixed fee will actually be per se, because the allocation of surplus, we have still we have one upstream firm, we have two downstream firms, so it's not unrealistic to assume that they kind of bargain or negotiate over the resulting surplus. There's no reason to believe that the upstream firm, even though it's a monopolist, has entirely the perfect bargaining position here and can extract all the surplus, right? So there might be profits, or there might be negotiations going on here, and the disagreement points here, I told you that in the context of H2 is a term from bargaining theory that tells you if you break up negotiations with a given party, what profit will you achieve then? What options do you have? And it's clear that the disagreement points or the outside options here are determined by scenario S. So you can always say, look, you can offer me a contract with RPM and a fixed fee at a variable price, but if I don't agree, then we are stuck at what we have if we don't find any agreement, right? So that is the outside option here, basically. This is just some thoughts on how to compute the equilibrium in the end. What is important to note is that with RPM and franchise fees, we can end up in a situation that resembles the first best solution, but it requires that we set a wholesale price below marginal cost. So we must have some kind of fixed fees that are paid from the downstream to the upstream level. Okay, lastly, we look at RPM and quantity forcing. So what does quantity forcing mean? Basically, that means that the upstream firm sets a target for the downstream firm that it has to achieve in terms of sales, and if it doesn't achieve that, it will not be paid, basically, right? In reality, it's probably not so drastic, but you still have kind of rebates and that stuff, but that's not really quantity forcing, but it could be quite extreme, and then we could consider that as quantity forcing, right? So we basically combine our RPM instrument with the quantity forcing component, right? So our starting point is that, similar to RPM, we assume that our first best prices are implemented. So with quantity forcing, we set the same price as with vertical integration. And the upstream firm basically forces the downstream firm to, or the downstream firms to sell at least the profit or the output in vertical integration, right? And that's like instead of a two-part tariff as we had in the RPM example with a fixed fee in the latter example, right? So this is basically our different mechanism, and if it doesn't sell so much, then it won't be paid, basically. Okay, or won't receive the good anyway, but there could be like fines in the contracts or what have you. Okay, so how does the maximization problem look like? Well, basically retailer I chooses its service provision, so the retail prices are fixed, so it's only about service provision, to maximize its profits here, under the constraint that that the vertical integration output must be sold, right? So technically we would have to have something like this here, right? So at least this quantity, but this would require us to dig a little bit deeper into the maximization problem, which we don't want at that point, right? Here we only have basically a linear maximization problem, and we have our typical Lagrangian that we're setting up. And if we set up, like you can do that as a practice, if you set up the Lagrangian here, just take this is the objective, then plus lambda times the shadow price times this constraint here, basically. And then we differentiate the Lagrangian with respect to the shadow price, and we will end up with this function here, right? Then we assume that we have symmetry on the retail level, so EI and EJ are the same in equilibrium, and therefore we have this term here as the service provision level with quantity forcing, right? And if you calculate that, then you will end up, so this is exogenous, this is exogenous. So if you just substitute our optimal vertical integration output and price, then you will see that the resulting service provision is equal to our first best service provision, right? So just take this first order condition, realize that there is symmetry, substitute PVI and QVI, and solve the problem, and you will see that this service provision is exactly equal to the first best. Okay, so what we have seen so far is that with quantity forcing in RPM, we fix the price at the first best level, we fix the quantity at the first best level. If we do that, the result will be the service provision also being equal to the optimal level. And we see in that process that the wholesale price plays no role. It's incentive neutral. Right? So it doesn't affect the results at all, at least not qualitatively. All it does is affecting how the surplus is divided among the parties, right? So what you basically does is to use the wholesale price to extract the entire surplus. And here, if we assume that there is basically a take it or leave it situation, then it would choose a wholesale price with quantity forcing that extracts the entire profit from the downstream firm, right? That could be a solution here, even though I told you last time that they might actually bargain. But if they don't, then this would be the wholesale price that extracts the entire surplus, right? And what we see is that the upstream profit is as in vertical integration, the entire industry profit in vertical integration. So it's basically exactly the same outcome as with vertical integration, because we have the same price, we have the same quantity, we have the same service provision, and we have the same profits, right? So everything is the same as with vertical integration if we are in a setup with quantity forcing and RPM. So we can completely replicate the vertical integration outcome. Okay, so let's talk about RPM a little bit more, right? So if you want to look at the guidelines, then you can look at this document here with, sorry, that is the German abbreviation. The English one would be this one. So look at paragraphs 223 at sequential, so all the following paragraphs here. There it is described. Let me just briefly comment on that, so just give you an overview. Basically, in the European Union, RPM is treated as a 101 restriction, so per se, violation of competition law, even though basically it's possible to apply 101.3. We have notable exceptions from this rule, and these are fixed book price system and prescription drugs. Especially in Germany, the fixed book price system is an exception here, even though fixed book price systems are like present all over the world. For instance, in Japan, they also have one, at least as far as I know, they had like last year. And in France, for instance, they also have one. Whereas there are other systems, like for instance in the US, prices are not, there's no RPM on books basically. Another notable example is prescription drugs. So if you want to, for instance in Germany, if you buy a prescription drug, so if you are prescribed medication and you go to a pharmacy, you always pay the same price for that prescription drug, right? And there's like, there was 2016, there was a decision by the European Court of Justice that basically said that online retailers that were not located in Germany were allowed to offer rebates, and there's like currently some interesting changes going on with respect to the system that we're also examining at our chair, so just stay up to date with our current research. There will be something coming up here. Like, if we look at the anti-competitive effects of RPM, the most obvious one is pretty clear. It eliminates price competition downstream. And that could have effects on inter-brand and intra-brand competition. Pretty clear, that's a detrimental effect. And it might also ease collusion. There are papers on that by like Mark Ivaldi, for instance. I think it's Mark Ivaldi. Anyway, so there are papers, just look at RPM and collusion, and you will find a lot of papers here that address that issue. One reason might be that it improves monitoring, because there's basically no secret undercutting, basically, right? So you might deviate from it, but RPM is still in place, and you can monitor that better, and that allows for a more stable cartel. We could also have foreclosure aspects here, as if there's a retailer that sells multiple products and some of these products are under an RPM regime, and for those products margins might be higher than for other products where there is no RPM, so they might shift their sales efforts towards these products with higher margins, right? So these could be things that might be anti-competitive in terms of RPM. Okay, so let us lastly talk about exclusivity clauses. Exclusivity clauses are situations where there is a firm that tells its buyers to only buy their products from this manufacturer, right? So exclusive delivery or supply of this single manufacturer here. And here we formalize the idea here, just briefly to get an intuition here. Let us assume there is a monopolistic incumbent that produces a homogeneous good at constant marginal cost, CI, I for incumbent. Then we have monopoly profits with a linear price. Pretty clear, so we know that. We have learned that in chapter A basically, and we have used that multiple times. So that's the monopoly price here, that's the monopoly profit for the incumbent. The consumer surplus in this situation is A minus C to the power of 2 over 8. Now, there is an entrant, potential entrant, and this entrant is more efficient, so it has lower marginal cost. And if this entrant enters the market, then the two firms would compete in prices, and the entrant would choose a price that is slightly below the incumbent's price, and the incumbent would be driven out of the market. It would be good for consumers because prices would decrease, right? To that point here, right? So the new price will be approximately the incumbent's marginal cost, and consumer surplus would increase. So it's better for consumers to have entry. So what could the incumbent do? And here the idea of exclusivity clauses comes into play. So the incumbent would try to deter entry by approaching the consumer or the consumers to sign a contract, a long-term contract, to only exclusively buy from the incumbent. The buyer or the buyers will only accept this type of contract if consumer surplus increases. Otherwise, they would just not sign the contract, expect entry and benefit, right? And the crucial point here is that with entry, the consumer surplus increases by this one minus this one, right? So the consumer surplus with entry minus the consumer surplus. Oh, I just realized here, this should be an M. So the consumer surplus increases by this amount here, basically, right? So if the incumbent wants to sign such a contract with the consumers or the buyer, whatever, then it would have to offer the buyer a surplus of at least this amount. However, if we compare this one here with this one, we note that the monopoly profit of the incumbent is not sufficiently high to compensate the buyer for the loss in consumer surplus that they would incur by signing such an exclusivity clause, right? So it would be better for the consumers here to just not sign the contract, let entry happen, let the incumbent leave the market, and benefit from lower prices here, because the incumbent cannot offer sufficiently high rent to the buyer or the buyers to compensate them for signing a long-term contract. So here, an exclusivity clause could not be implemented. However, you get the idea here, right? So it's basically a situation where the incumbent or any firm wants to have exclusive agreements with a buyer, and it has to offer the buyer something for it because the buyer will be restricted. And the benefit that the buyer gets from the exclusivity agreement has to outweigh its cost, and the costs are basically what it loses if it signs the contract. Okay, so now these are all the examples of vertical restraints that we wanted to talk about in this lecture. So we're done for this one. I hope you liked the video. We would be very happy if you thumbs up if you like the video, if you subscribe to our channel, and if you leave comments in the comment section below. So it could be questions, discussions, whatever. We would be very happy. So that's it from me. We will see you in the next one. Thank you.